If you are looking to lower your anxiety, you kind of have to know where it comes from before you can be effective in treating it. In this video, I'm going to give you 5 psychodynamic causes of anxiety that might be impacting you and what you need to do about them. So there is a lot of talk and so many videos on managing anxiety, soothing anxiety, attachment and anxiety, trauma and anxiety, but I think we're running the risk of overlooking some of the core causes of anxiety that people like Freud and Melanie Klein were talking about decades ago. So I tried to summarize some of these core principles into 5 layers of anxiety, and they fit together a bit like this Russian stacking doll. My name is Oliver, and I'm a family therapist here in Los Angeles. I love thinking and working in family systems, and I also love psychoanalytic theory. Bit complicated like that. There are 5 layers to this stacking doll of anxiety. The outer one is to do with reality and what goes on in the real world. The next layer in is about existential anxiety. The first layer of our stacking doll of anxiety is to do with reality. This is perhaps the most obvious type of anxiety that we have. It's the stress that comes from being alive in the world, from worrying about having enough money to pay rent or that exam that you've got next week. It also includes the anxiety that comes from having something really traumatic or just crappy happen, like getting in a car crash or being mugged. For some time after getting mugged, for example, you're going to be on alert when you walk home. And if you're in a car accident, you might have some anxiety about driving again. This accounts for some layers of the trauma, but I want to make it clear that all of the layers in this doll overlap. So we'll be coming back to it later. What to do about it? As a therapist, when I'm working with a client who has some symptoms of anxiety, I'm going to be checking this layer out first. And I'll be wondering if my client's reality testing is too tough or too weak. Accurate reality testing means that somebody is assigning appropriate amounts of anxiety to the event. And a distortion in reality testing is either going to assign too much anxiety or too little. Let's take the example of your driving test. So for most of us, assuming that you practiced and studied, it's quite a big deal. But it's also not a life and death situation because you can take it again if you fail. Someone with a distortion in their reality testing is either going to make this such a big deal in their mind that their anxiety is crippling before the exam, or they're going to have no anxiety about taking the test and they won't be motivated to study or practice and will probably fail. So we do need some anxiety to motivate us and drive us forward, but too much and it starts crippling us, and too little and we don't do anything. If we knew someone who was at either end of this spectrum, we would want to understand how much importance or significance they're assigning to this event. And perhaps in some cases we need to lower it, and others we need to raise it so that they're motivated. The next layer in our stacking dolls is about existential anxiety. And this is essentially a human condition that occurs to most of us to some degree at some point in our lives when we begin to question the nature of existence and what the purpose of life, the universe, and everything is. To some people, pondering such thoughts brings about intense amounts of anxiety. Existential anxiety comes from thinking about 4 issues around existence: death, freedom, isolation, and meaning. Isolation and connection is a constant back and forth in human beings, but I think the existential debate is, even if you do meet someone and you fall in love, do they ever really know you, or are we all just destined to be alone? Freedom is about the lack of external structure that would exist without society and the structures that we've created as a species. Death is all about the futility of life, when we're all going to die at some point, and so what's the point? And meaning is questioning why we do it all. I want to say 2 things about freedom as well. Freedom is the reason why people join cults and follow gurus, because there's a huge amount of anxiety that comes up when you think about all of the decisions that you have to make ever in your life in order to be successful. That anxiety is taken away from you if you join a cult. It will follow a guru who tells you exactly what to do and when to do it. And the other thing about freedom and adolescence is that I have noticed in my career and life that teenagers without a structure will often fall into depression or anxiety. And in fact, it's one of the reasons why residential treatment is so good for teenagers is because every hour of the day is programmed. And after a while, they get into the flow of things and they like it. They probably won't ever admit that, but it does make a difference. What to do about existential anxiety? So some of this is quite obvious, right? If somebody is looking for meaning, then you're going to help them explore their passions and find their purpose. If they don't have structure in their lives, you're going to help them create little structures or even rituals. I think back to the idea that every culture in the world has some ritual, and it's all to do with lowering this existential anxiety we have. Somebody is questioning isolation or feeling disconnected. I like to encourage connection, and I will usually always recommend a mixed process group. And death is the final one. And I'm not sure what we can do really about death other than help people understand and explore their anxiety around it. Often that's just the comfort that you need, somebody listening and being curious about your thoughts and feelings about our own mortality. Next layer down on our anxiety dolls is the inner critic, which is part of our internal conversation that tells us what to do, what not to do, corrects us, tells us when we're doing something wrong. It is a lovely piece of work. This aspect of our psyche is developed when we are young and sounds spookily similar to the way our parents corrected us. And that's because it's made up of various components of our parents and caregivers and our upbringing. We will interject aspects of our upbringing into our minds when we're young. We assimilate the warm, nurturing part of our childhood caregivers' voices, and we also internalize the criticism and discipline that we receive. I want to clarify this because some of my clients will tell me at this point that they had a great childhood and their parents weren't at all mean. So it's not about whether they were mean or not. It's more about how they corrected you or reprimanded you, which they absolutely did because you were a kid and needed to be told things like, don't touch the oven, it's hot, or don't run out into the street. We all had an aspect of childhood like that. It's also not a carbon copy of our parents either. It's snippets and slivers and aspects of their personality, which is also influenced by culture, media, and the environment we grew up in. So if, for example, you went to a Catholic school in the backwaters of England and you had evil nuns who had a tendency to throw chalk at you when you were talking or were eager to slap you if you dropped your lunch, then you're probably going to have a pretty harsh inner critic. The inner critic and our inner world is made up of aspects of these guiding forces, both the good and the bad. And they create this voice that tells you what you should be doing and how you should behave. If your inner critic is too harsh, then you are going to feel anxious when it berates you for dropping your keys or getting a B in geography or burning the toast. You can also feel very anxious in anticipation of a beating from your critical inner voice. If you know you haven't studied hard enough before an exam, your anxiety going in to take it will partly be due to the dread of knowing that you're going to get a whipping from your inner critic when you get the results. So what do we do about the critical inner voice? I want to first of all understand what the inner critic is saying to my clients. I want to be able to hear how harsh it is and understand just how punitive it is. When clients tell me this or start to narrate what goes on, they're often a little bit embarrassed because saying it out loud is really quite profound, as they know they'd never talk to anybody else the way that they talk to themselves. And that's often the beginning of a little bit of a change. If you listen closely, you can hear that some of the things that this inner critic bugs you about are utterly irrational. They don't make any sense. And I think when you catch on to that, it helps put a little bit of space in between the thoughts and the feelings. And over time, it should be enough space for you to realize that you don't have to listen to it all of the time. Engaging with the inner critic is probably the worst thing you can do. because you're going to be feeling more anxious the more you listen to it. And the bad news is you're probably in the habit of doing it anyway. I remind clients that you can't really control the thoughts that come into your head, but you can control the amount of attention that you give those thoughts. So the inner critic's going to speak to you, but you can choose whether you engage in it or change the subject, change the channel of thoughts in your head by getting up and doing something different. The next layer of our anxiety doll is about feelings. Freud's original explanation for anxiety was to do with repressed, lustful urges and sexuality. And in his defense, society was very different back then. And they weren't so open about sex and sexuality. So I could see where he was coming from, but I think there's been a lot of changes in our culture since then. He also might not have been able to separate his own bias about sex because at the time of writing it, he'd already had enough kids and didn't really want any more. However, there's still a lot to be said about the idea of suppressed or repressed feelings being the cause of anxiety and distress. The act of repressing or resisting the emergence of powerful feelings like rage or perhaps sometimes lust causes a huge amount of anxiety. It's this tension that builds in us when we have to keep locking this eruption down. If we are afraid of how destructive our anger or rage is, then we're going to be experiencing some anxiety. And if you're actively trying to suppress that rage, then you're very likely to feel some anxiety and if not, have panic attacks. I think panic attacks and suppressed rage go hand in hand. What do we do about it? Well, I want to encourage the healthy expression of anger. I want all of my clients to be able to turn their thoughts and feelings into words, not actions. So the final and core layer of our anxiety doll here is about attachment and infancy. Freud's original ideas of anxiety and infancy are the basis of modern attachment theory. And in fact, John Bowlby, who was part of the team with Mary Ainsworth, who created attachment theory, was a psychoanalyst. He trained in neo-Freudian object relations. So he knew all of this stuff. In a nutshell, Freud said that there are 3 parts to core anxiety that come from childhood. Number 1, fear of the loss of the caregiver. So if my caregiver disappears, I'm going to die. Makes total sense because as an infant, we are utterly dependent on our caregivers. 2, fear that my caregiver is going to stop loving me. They basically equate to the same thing. If my caregiver stops loving and caring about me, will they feed me? Will they hold me? Will they, look after me if I'm sick? The same sort of thing. And it's about loss of love though. A third part is a little more complicated to explain, and it had a terrible name called castration anxiety. But if you can ignore the horrible sexism that is in there, bear with me because it is quite important. All it means is that at some point in the child's life, they realize that they can delight their caregiver. So they have the ability to draw mum and dad in, and mum and dad make cooey faces and smile and, read them bedtime stories. But that power comes from within, and losing that is equal to losing their love and losing the caregiver. If I can't engage my caregiver, what is going to happen to me? It's a core anxiety that sticks around all the way through to adulthood, as we'll see. So to put this in context, there's a client that I'm consulting on that has been married for 30 years, who has considerable amounts of anxiety. It's really quite crippling to them. As I learned more about this client and what's going on between them and their partner, some of these core Freudian principles really stood out. So partner keeps threatening to leave them. The partner is ambivalent about sex and romance, and the partner does not really initiate any romantic gestures, no touch even. And the partner is also very critical of this client and anything that the client does. It sounds like a really tough situation. If you substitute the word partner and parent, it sounds an awful lot like Freud's 3 core principles here. My partner is going to leave me. My partner does not love me. My partner does not seem interested in me, and I don't have the ability to get their attention. those are the three core things that we just talked about that a baby goes through. So part of this client's anxiety is very old infant anxieties that have been stirred up by whatever's going on in their relationship right now. So what do you do about it? Well, it's going to be hard to know if this is the cause of your anxiety. So you do need to get some professional help. A therapist who is trained in psychodynamic theory or attachment theory would be really helpful. Personally, I'm a big fan of separating out the scared inner child or the inner baby from the adult you and helping my clients reparent their freaked out, terrified baby in a more calming, nurturing, supportive way. Once you start reparenting the scared young parts of you, I think you see huge changes in anxiety and stress and well-being.